The invisible workers of Nineveh, how the greatest city in the Bible was built. Nineveh, the greatest city in the Bible. But almost no one knows who really built this colossus. It wasn't kings, it wasn't generals. It was invisible workers, captured, deported, forced to build an entire capital on top of a swamp. Today, we will reveal the story that the Bible mentions only in the shadows, the life, the suffering, and the human genius behind the city that made the world tremble. Imagine a king who wants the world to tremble at the sight of his capital. Imagine that capital rising not on solid rock, but on a marshland by the Tigris, mud and reeds, a landscape that resists every plan. How do you make a monument out of a swamp? Who hauls the weight of empire onto a place that refuses to hold it? Around 700 BCE, King Sennacherib set out to do exactly that. He ordered a new capital, larger, more terrifying than any city before. He envisioned walls that could be seen for miles, gates guarded by colossal winged bulls, and a palace whose reliefs would stencil his victories into stone. The story celebrated in his inscriptions is one of power and precision. The archaeology tells another story of staggering engineering and of a hidden human cost. This is the account of the invisible workers of Nineveh, the nameless hands that turned marsh into mountain, logs into roofs, and mud into monuments. Visual, wide aerial reconstruction of Nineveh rising from a marsh. Overlay, c. 700 BCE Assyrian Empire. Cut to close-ups of hands shaping mud bricks. The decision to found a capital at that precise bend of the Tigris was neither accidental nor sentimental. It was strategic, a statement of dominance over the river and over the trade routes that ran along it. But the location posed a problem. The plain was waterlogged, unstable, ever hungry for the loads a grand city would place upon it. Archaeological evidence suggests the solution was radical. Raise the land itself. Create an artificial platform that would bear the weight of palaces and walls, not with cranes or machines, but with human backs and baskets. How do you build a platform large enough for a capital? The short answer is you move earth by the millions of loads. Long baskets of loam, carried on shoulders, dragged in sledges, deposited and tamped down again and again until mud becomes a kind of foundation. Reliefs and later archaeological reconstructions imply an operation on an industrial scale. Contemporary estimates suggest tens of thousands of workers engaged in this work at any one time. Some scholars place the total labor force involved in the city's construction in the range of 40,000 to 50,000 people, though precise numbers are uncertain. What is certain is that the scale was enormous, and that most of the people doing this work were not volunteers. Visual, handheld shots of baskets, workers tamping earth, map overlays showing the city footprint. These were deportees and captives, men and women uprooted from their homes in conquered lands. The Assyrian imperial system specialized in relocation. Move restless populations, move skilled artisans to the imperial center, disperse potential resistance. Among those brought to Nineveh were Israelites and Judeans taken in the waves of conquest. They arrived under guard and found themselves organized into labor gangs by ethnicity and skill, supervised by layers of captains and overseers. The labor was organized with chilling efficiency. Rations were meted and managed. Food in the ancient Near East was not simply a matter of calories. It was also public health and control. Beer, baked bread, barley porridge. Archaeologists note the prominence of beer as a staple because its low water content and fermentation made it safer to drink than many water sources. Records and reliefs indicate large-scale provisioning systems. Workers were fed, housed in camps, marched, and drilled. The provisioning was necessary, but it was also a mechanism of control. Hunger and thirst punished. Favor and extra rations rewarded. Executions, floggings, and public examples were part of the regime that kept the project moving. Visual, close-up on clay tablets or reconstructions of feeding distribution. B-roll, slow pan across ruins of workers' quarters. To transform raw marsh into solid ground required rhythm. Tens of thousands of men working in synchrony, guided by sound and by command. The same need for coordination shows up again and again in the ways the Assyrians moved extraordinary loads. Trees the size of houses, monolithic stones, and statues whose weight would crush a single team. Cedar logs had to come from the mountains of Lebanon, hundreds of miles away. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that specialized logging gangs felled these trees, bound them into rafts, and sent them downriver when possible. Other logs were hauled overland by teams of men and animals over rough tracks and temporary roads. The images in the palace reliefs, stylized but revealing, show men hauling enormous trunks with ropes and poles, often worked in relays. Stone posed a different problem. For monumental structures, for the aqueduct at Jerwan, for paved roads, for finely cut architectural elements, quarried limestone was necessary. The quarries were often a day's march away. Workers fractured the stone, cut blocks to size, then placed them on sledges. To move these sledges over soft ground required ingenious techniques. Archaeological experiments and depictions suggest the use of rollers made from logs, greased paths, and, in some accounts, a thin layer of water or oil applied to reduce friction. Coordinated teams would haul with ropes in time to drums or shouts, a human metronome that made impossible loads move a few inches at a time. Visual, diagram explaining rollers and sledges, reenactment of a team hauling a heavy stone with drums beating. There is a frequent temptation in modern retelling to imagine these as purely mechanical operations, to admire the logistics and forget the hands. But the logistics were lived by individual people. Calloused palms, torn shoulders, crushed toes, sudden slips. Accidents happened. Loads shifted. Whole teams could be buried beneath a slide. Reliefs and administrative records from Assyrian archives do not catalog every injury. That was not their purpose. But references to punishments for failing to meet quotas and to systems that replaced lost workers with new captives point to a turnover that suggests high mortality and relentless strain. At the heart of the city's water supply stands the Jerwan Aqueduct, an engineering solution both ingenious and symbolic. Built to bring clean mountain water across low ground into Nineveh's heart, it was constructed of cut stone blocks sealed with bitumen, a technique that preserved its function across seasons. Archaeological evidence dates it to Sennacherib's reign and suggests that it required an enormous number of dressed stones. Some reconstructions suggest over 1 million individual blocks in the broader waterworks, others are more conservative. What is undisputed is the scale and the precision. Channels, sluices, and carefully sloped gradients that most likely required skilled engineers, surveyors, and a demanding labor force to quarry, dress, transport, and set each stone. If the Jerwan Aqueduct illustrates complex engineering, the city's defenses reveal military genius blended with terror. Nineveh's walls, described in later Greek and biblical sources as stupendously high and long, were not merely tall earthen ramparts. Archaeological and textual data point to a system of multiple walls, inner and outer belts, a defensive ditch perhaps as much as 40 meters wide in places, and a design that funneled attackers into a narrow space where defenders could rain down destruction, what some historians call a death corridor. Towers and bastions multiplied fields of fire, and gates were designed as funnels and traps. One remarkable image that comes down to us is of the Lamassu, enormous guardian figures with human heads, winged bodies, and leonine forms. These colossal sculptures flanked gates and thresholds, their carved faces looking out with a frozen blend of majesty and menace. According to archaeological interpretations and relief imagery, moving these statues into place required complex logistics. Sledges, ropes, lubricated paths, ramped earthen embankments, and precise final raising maneuvers. The reliefs show teams pulling in concert, overseers standing with whips and rods, and the rhythm maintained by drums or shouted cadences. Again, the people who carved and moved these beasts were often the conquered themselves. Visual, reliefs of Lamassu, slow crossfade to reenactments of crews hauling a statue. On-screen note, reliefs indicate coordinated pulling and lubrication techniques. There is a moral distortion in admiring the technical virtuosity without naming who paid. The palace walls themselves were a kind of propaganda museum. Scenes of siege, of bound captives, of exiled peoples, under the watchful eye of a triumphant king. Ironically and painfully, many of the artisans who carved these images were themselves among the subjugated populations whose defeat they had to narrate. Their chisel strokes set the imperial story in stone, while their own names and pains went unremembered. The reliefs announce dominance. The people who made them embody the cost. Consider the everyday architecture that made life possible in a massive urban center. Storehouses, bakeries, breweries, workshops. Each required skilled labor. Potters and metalworkers, carpenters and masons often came from lands the empire had subdued and were relocated to the capital. Their expertise made the city's economy function. Their labor filled the granaries that fed the workforce, the breweries that provided safe drink, and the kilns that baked the bricks that in turn held the walls together. The system ran on a mixture of coercion and technical dependence. The empire could conquer and command, but it could not produce the craft knowledge without the people it had displaced. Visual, interior reconstructions of workshops, B-roll of modern artisans to draw parallels. Sennacherib's inscriptions are blunt about what he wanted, a capital that announced his power, one whose very architecture testified to his control over nature and people. But ancient sources are not the only voice. The Hebrew prophetic tradition records a different kind of rhetoric. The prophet Nahum, writing in poetic and condemnatory language, pronounces the coming destruction of Nineveh. In broad strokes, Nahum speaks of devastation by water and by fire. He envisions the city's walls falling and its gates breached. The biblical text frames the events as divine judgment, a theological assertion, while the historical record invites correlation. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh, and reports suggest that overflowing rivers and internal collapse combined with fires to bring the city down. Archaeological layers indicate burning and sudden abandonment. The very mud brick foundations that were built up as a miracle of human labor may have become Nineveh's undoing when floodwaters undermined them. Visual, slow pan of a Nahum manuscript or illuminated text. Overlay, Nahum 1-3, prophetic pronouncements of Nineveh's fall. Then cut to stormy river footage and ruins. The collapse was catastrophic and complex. A siege, assaults from without, internal chaos, and nature's agency all played parts. Contemporary accounts and later historians describe intense flooding during the assault, sluices and walls failing, and fires consuming wooden structures. There is a historical irony that carries a bitter edge. The fire that destroyed the royal palace and much of the city also baked clay tablets and sealed them in ways that eventually preserved them for millennia. What the conquerors meant to erase, the administrative records, letters, and royal annals, in some cases survived precisely because they were fired by the flames. The destruction that ended Nineveh's dominance also inadvertently safeguarded a record of how it had been made. Throughout this narrative, the recurring figure is not the king on his throne, but the worker on the ground. They were invisible in life and often anonymous in death. Yet their labor was the literal foundation of imperial ambition. To call them invisible workers is not only a metaphor, it is a moral claim. The city's grandeur depended upon groups of displaced people whose suffering is seldom the centerpiece in grand histories. Their presence in the archaeological and textual record is fragmented. A name on an administrative tablet, a carved profile in the margin of a relief, the remains of a temporary camp. Piecing those fragments together gives back a voice to people otherwise written out of the story. What did those voices sound like? We can imagine them. A cadence of drums and shouted commands as a statue inches along a greased path. The dull thud of tamped earth as baskets are emptied into a trench. The ring of chisels on stone. The barked orders of a captain, and the low conversation in a language not native to the land. Archaeological reconstructions and comparative ethnographic examples provide fragments of rhythm and labor patterns, but the human details, names, private fears, the small consolations are mostly lost. That absence is itself a kind of historical testimony. Empires write their own names large. The subaltern leave traces that require patient reading. The city's defenses and grand architecture were effective for a time. The aqueduct delivered mountain water, the walls repelled assaults, the palace's intimidation did what it was meant to do. But technical prowess and terror cannot fully master the elements or the politics of an age. Empires depend upon supply lines, on consistent workforces, and on the compliance of subject peoples, all fragile under pressure. When a coalition rose against Nineveh, when the hydrology of the Tigris conspired with human assault, the supposedly permanent city could not withstand the coalition of forces arrayed against it. There is an irony that cuts through both the archaeological and the biblical narratives. The prophet Nahum's indictment frames Nineveh's fall as moral justice, a theological account of punishment for brutality. The historical narrative shows how an engineered solution to a practical problem, a city built on a platform of human labor, became vulnerable when the very forces it tried to master intervened. Floods, fires, alliances, and internal stresses combined to undo what had seemed invincible. The city that had terrified neighbors with its walls and sculptures was itself susceptible to water and to fire. Visual montage of waves, flames, and toppled sculptures, slow dissolve to empty fields where a city once stood. What remains today are ruins and fragments, and the tablets that fossilized administrative lists. From them, we learn not only the dates and the tallies, but also the mode of empire. Domination through relocation, infrastructure built on dispossession, technical success underwriting moral costs. Modern archaeology provides the scaffolding to read those traces, but interpretation requires a moral imagination that attends to the invisible. There is a further twist to this history. The reliefs designed to terrify and the lamassu made to awe are also, paradoxically, monuments to the very people they oppressed. The artisans who carved the battle scenes and the captives' names were often members of the conquered communities. Their craftsmanship survives. Their hands made the visual language of empire. In this sense, the city itself bears a testimony that can be read against the grain, the rhetoric of domination carved by those who had been dominated. Visual, close-up of relief scenes, overlay text, artisans often came from subjugated peoples. To reflect on Nineveh is to confront a pattern that reappears across history. Large-scale human achievement often rests on unseen labor and coerced sacrifice. The moral question is not whether the aqueduct was brilliant or the walls formidable. The moral question is who paid for those achievements and at what cost to human dignity. Recognizing the invisible workers does not erase technological admiration. It reframes it. The engineering remains impressive, but its brilliance sits beside a ledger of human lives. Uprooted families, broken bodies, coerced expertise. That ledger demands acknowledgement. As a closing image, return to the marsh that became a capital. Imagine hands sinking into damp earth, lifting, filling, tamping, returning, day after day, season after season. Think of the cedar logs arriving downriver, of teams hauling with rhythmic chants, of the masons aligning block after block. Now imagine the slow, distant thunder of siege engines, rain that rises in the swollen river, the crackle of flame as wooden beams ignite, the sudden silence after the fall. Empires rise and fall. Clay is baked by fire and becomes a record. Statues topple, gates collapse, and the people who built them remain largely unnamed in the grand narratives. In remembering Nineveh, let the center of the story be the invisible workers. Let their labor be the frame through which we view the city's monuments. That reframing matters because it restores a human scale to history. It asks us to hold technical achievements and moral judgment together, to admire skill and to mourn its human price. It asks us, finally, to recognize that monuments outlast empires, and yet the stories behind them are fragile unless we tell them. If this story has put a name to the unnamed and given weight to the invisible, then the past has done its work. It has become testimony. For those who want to follow the thread into other ancient cities built by similar means, where engineering, coercion, and prophecy intersect, there are more histories to explore. On-screen prompt, like and subscribe for more explorations of ancient histories. Finally, remember the lesson of the marsh and the mountain of earth. Sennacherib's capital was a triumph of planning and brutality. It was a masterclass in logistics and a ledger of suffering. The prophet Nahum declared the city's fall in terms of moral reckoning. The historical record shows how water and fire, politics and labor conspired to bring it down in 612 BC. The greatest city in the Bible was built by the invisible, and its ruins continue to speak. The question for us that remains is simple and stark. When we admire monuments, will we also remember the people who made them? Visual, final shot of a solitary hand on a carved stone. On-screen caption, watch next, The Mystery of Jericho. Subscribe for more history with faith and archaeology.